Hello everyone, Ken and Gavin here coming to you from Orange Tree at the PGA Merchandise Show. Today we're going to talk a little bit about some of the technologies that we have with ACCRA. Why don't we start off with Dymatch? That's something that is big for us. So how did the idea come up and where did it come from and how does it work?
Well, Dymatch was a philosophy that was kind of interesting. That it really came originally from the PGA Tour. When we were looking at fitting PGA Tour players, we saw that most tour players, and this goes back 10, 12 years, were using different shafts in their drivers and 3-woods or 5-woods and hybrids.
Yeah.
And it was like, why is that? And we started looking at the profiles of the shafts that they were using. And tour players, for the most part, are not the most geeky guys. They use what works.
Right.
And they don't necessarily understand the profiles of the shafts and what it's supposed to do. They just know what works for them. And one thing we found is that the majority of tour players are using a more stable tip driver shaft, and we're tending to using a shaft with a more responsive tip in their fairway woods. And so we kind of looked at that and said, well, why is that? Most companies were kind of designing shafts where they designed a really cool 65-gram driver shaft, and then they said, okay, let's make a 75-gram version, an 85-gram version, and kept the same profile. And then they told club fitters to tip them an inch.
Tip them an inch in for a
to make up for the weight,
yeah.
and that'll make it fine for fairway woods. And it's like, well, that doesn't make sense. We should be able to make shafts specifically for fairway woods and hybrids. So what we went through a process with a ballistic camera and strain gauges and robot testing and launch monitor testing with real players. And what we wanted to do was create the same launch conditions with a driver head. At the time, if you look at a driver head, I have one here, the distance between the center of the head and where the hosel is, or where the shaft enters the head, there's a certain distance there. And so when you strike a ball in the center of the face, there's a certain amount of twisting on the head. And what we found is that basically a more stable tip shaft reduced the twisting, and you needed that to create a specific ball flight. But a 3-wood's a little different, because a 3-wood, the distance between the center of the club and where the shaft enters the head is much closer.
Yes.
So obviously you don't need as stiff of a tip to be able to create the same torque. And what we want, exactly. So what we were trying to do really was create the same amount of twisting on the head on impact and the same amount of deflection on the shaft. And what we found through all this testing was that really a slightly more responsive tip shaft worked better in a fairway wood to create the same launch conditions as a more stable tip driver shaft. And so we created a whole line around that originally called the Dymatch, and we called dynamic matching, basically, is what it kind of was, or dynamically matched sets. And we created a philosophy that we've now incorporated into different lines of shafts for the past number of years, where we have specific driver shafts, fairway woods, and hybrid shafts that are all dynamically matched or die-matched to make up a set.
Yeah, so when a club fitter is fitting someone to a driver, an obvious choice for a fairway and a hybrid is now the matching model to that driver.
Exactly, it gives them lots of options, and we have lots of weight options and different launch options within each family of shafts. So that kind of makes it pretty cool too.
Yeah, cool. Well, thanks, Gav. That's Dymatch in a nutshell for you.